The wind swept across the barren hills, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. Rowan Hark, a man who had long abandoned the trappings of towns and laws, stood on the edge of his small cabin, boots sinking slightly into the frost-laden soil. The morning was gray, heavy with clouds that promised snow or storm, and the isolation weighed on him like a second skin. Out here, he had no neighbors, no lawmen, no companions, only the land, his animals, and the quiet rhythm of survival. He was tending to his sparse herd when he heard a groan carried faintly on the wind, uneven, strained, a sound that spoke of pain and exhaustion. Rowan's hand instinctively brushed the handle of the hunting knife at his belt. Few things wandered this far alone, and fewer still lived to tell the tale. He paused, scanning the ridges and valleys, until a figure staggered into view. The man was clad in armor, battered and scratched, his tabard stained with dark streaks that could only be blood. He leaned heavily on a sword, a crude crutch that seemed barely enough to hold him upright. His face, partially obscured by a dented helm, was pale and lined with sweat and grime. Every step he took seemed a struggle, each breath a battle. Rowan's instincts screamed danger, but something in the figure's eyes desperate, pleading stayed his hand. "Please," the knight rasped, his voice raw with pain. "Shelter. I need shelter. Before nightfall." Rowan hesitated, calculating the risk. Out here, harboring a wounded stranger could mean death. Raiders, bounty hunters, or enemies of the crown often left trails of violence behind them. And yet, there was something in the knight's posture, the exhaustion that bled through the armor, that spoke of honesty and desperation. Rowan felt the tug of curiosity and compassion, emotions he had long buried beneath the harshness of survival. "Why should I help you?" Rowan's voice was low, cautious. His eyes traced the knight's injuries, slashes across the arms, a deep gash in his shoulder, blood seeping through the worn fabric of his tabard. The stranger swayed, nearly collapsing to the snow-crusted ground. The knight coughed, the sound wet and painful. "Cannot survive out here. Not alone. I carry something they want, and if I fall now, it will be lost forever." His words were cryptic, but the urgency in his tone left no room for doubt. Rowan knew instinctively that the knight spoke truth. Desperation has a way of stripping lies from the lips of men. Rowan stepped closer, wary but resolute. "You can't make it to town," he said, scanning the horizon where faint shadows of distant ridges marked the edge of his property. "You'll die before anyone finds you there. If I take you in, you owe me your silence, and your word that you will cause me no trouble." The knight nodded, a shiver running through his frame. "My word," he whispered. "I swear it. I am no threat to you, only safety." With careful effort, Rowan guided the knight toward the cabin. Every step was deliberate, each movement weighted by the knowledge that failure to maintain balance could spell death. The knight's strength was ebbing rapidly. Rowan had to bear a portion of his weight, feeling the cold seep from the stranger's body into his own hands. It was a burden, yes, but also a bond forming in the quiet desperation of shared struggle. Inside the cabin, Rowan set the knight gently on a cot near the hearth. He removed the battered helm, revealing a face drawn with pain and streaked with blood and dirt. The knight's eyes were a storm of exhaustion, gratitude, and something else Rowan could not name: fear, perhaps, or shame. "I'll tend your wounds," Rowan said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We'll clean the blood, bind the cuts, and see if we can keep you alive through the night." He fetched a pot of water, warmed it carefully over the small fire, and worked with the precision of a man used to handling animals. But these were human wounds, and he felt the weight of responsibility press heavily against his chest. The knight flinched as the water and cloth touched his shoulder, but he did not cry out. "Thank you," he rasped. "For this. For not leaving me to die." Rowan met his gaze, seeing the vulnerability and the quiet acknowledgement that survival often depended not on skill alone, but on mercy. Night fell slowly, dragging shadows across the cabin walls, elongating them into shapes that seemed alive with threat. Outside, the wind howled over the hills, carrying the faint cries of distant wolves. Rowan remained vigilant, sharpening a blade and listening, aware that the quiet moments of peace could be shattered in an instant. But inside, the night slept, a fragile figure of armor and vulnerability, and Rowan felt a flicker of purpose stir in his chest. Hours passed with a rhythm of silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin or the wind against the shutters. Rowan watched the night, noting the rise and fall of his chest, the shallow breaths that spoke of pain and exhaustion. He thought of the world outside the chaos, the war, the men who hunted without mercy, and realized that, in this small cabin on a lonely hill, something rare had begun to bloom: trust. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of distant hoofbeats. Rowan's eyes snapped open. The night stirred, awakening with a soft groan. Rowan moved to the door, peering into the night. Several figures approached, mounted, their silhouettes sharp against the dim glow of the moon. They moved deliberately, their rhythm too precise to be wandering travelers. Rowan felt the tension coil in his stomach. The night's quiet had been deceptive. Danger was near. He returned to the cot, placing a reassuring hand on the knight's shoulder. "Stay down," he whispered. "Don't make a sound. I'll handle this." The knight nodded weakly, eyes wide with fear and trust all at once. Rowan crossed the cabin swiftly, loading his rifles and preparing for the confrontation. The first rider reached the cabin, dismounting with a fluid motion that spoke of skill and intent. Rowan's hand steadied on the trigger, but he did not fire. The rider's voice, carried over the wind, was cold, commanding. "We know he's here. Hand him over, and no one gets hurt." Rowan's response was measured, calm. "He is under my roof. Leave now or face the consequences." The rider laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "Consequences?" he echoed. "You are alone against men trained for war. You will not survive the night." But Rowan did not flinch. The cabin, the fire, and the wounded knight were more than just shelter. They were a statement. A statement that courage and resolve could stand against overwhelming odds. And in the shadows, the faint glow of the knight's armor caught the firelight, a silent promise that this fight was not his alone. The night had deepened, casting the prairie in a cloak of silver shadows. Rowan Hark remained by the hearth, the firelight flickering across the cabin walls, illuminating the jagged lines of the knight's battered armor. Each rise and fall of the man's chest told a story of pain endured and battles survived. Rowan could see the faint tremor in his hands as he adjusted the blankets, the quiet shiver of someone clinging to life. Finally, the knight stirred, head lifting just enough to meet Rowan's gaze. His eyes, a piercing gray streaked with exhaustion, betrayed the truth he had tried to hide: betrayal, pursuit, and a mission that carried consequences far beyond this cabin. "You saved me," he whispered, voice hoarse. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Rowan shrugged, his hands busy checking the bindings on a deep gash along the knight's arm. "You didn't choose to fall into the snow out here, did you? I didn't exactly volunteer for company either. We help when we can, and sometimes that's enough." The knight gave a faint, humorless smile. "You have more courage than most men I've met in my life." He paused, swallowing, as if the words themselves cost him strength. "I am Sir Alaric, of the Eastern Guard. I was betrayed by my own command. They wanted the map I carry, the one that leads to the hidden stronghold. If it falls into the wrong hands..." His voice trailed off. "Haunted." Rowan leaned closer, the firelight casting shadows across Alaric's sharp features. "The wrong hands?" Rowan asked, tension tightening in his chest. "Who's after you?" Alaric's eyes flickered toward the window, to the ridge beyond, as if he could already sense their approach. "Men sent by my own kingdom. And worse. Mercenaries. Hired killers. They will not stop until I am dead or the map is theirs." Rowan's jaw tightened. He had faced men seeking revenge, claim jumpers, and desperate thieves. But the idea of a small, isolated cabin being the target for professional killers brought a new edge to the cold night. Then you'll stay here, Rowan said firmly. And I'll make sure they don't find you until dawn. Alaric coughed, the sound wet and painful. I don't wish to bring danger to you. You're already here, Rowan replied simply. It's too late for that. Hours passed in a tense quiet. Rowan kept watch by the window, eyes scanning the horizon where shadows seemed to twist and dance. Alaric, though weakened, sat upright on the cot, recounting fragments of battles, betrayals, and alliances that had crumbled. Each tale was a revelation, a glimpse into a world beyond the prairie one, of politics, power, and violence that moved like a storm, unseen until it struck. By midnight, distant hoofbeats again disturbed the stillness. Rowan's hands tightened on his rifle. This time, the sound was closer, more precise, moving with deadly intent. Alaric's eyes met his, and despite his exhaustion, there was recognition, a spark of fear edged with determination. "They've found me," he said simply. Outside, the men approached, their formation disciplined and cold. Rowan could see the glint of steel, the practiced movements of those who had hunted before. He assessed them swiftly, too many for a frontal assault, but they were not invincible. Not with Alaric's knowledge and the clever traps Rowan could set around the cabin. "We need a plan," Rowan whispered. Alaric nodded, pain evident in the grimace that crossed his face. "Trust me," he rasped. "There are ways to buy us time, ways to call for help if you survive the first wave." Rowan studied him, realizing that this dying night carried more than a map. He carried the potential for allies, reinforcements, men who could turn the tide. "Then we prepare," Rowan said. "We make them think twice." They moved quickly, setting traps, barricading doors, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Alaric, though weakened, directed Rowan's hands with precision born of battlefield experience, instructing him on weak points, likely approaches, and timing. Each instruction carried weight, the air thick with urgency and the scent of smoke from the fire. As the night stretched on, a strange thing happened. Rowan noticed the rhythm of the hoofbeats changing, the distant hum of additional riders approaching, not with aggression, but with coordination. Alaric's eyes lit with hope, despite the pain etched on his face. "It's them," he whispered. "My men, my brothers in arms. They've tracked me. If they arrive in time—" Rowan's pulse quickened. The thought of reinforcements offered a rare spark of optimism. Yet the danger remained immediate. The enemy was near, skilled, and relentless. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. "Then we hold," he said firmly. "No one breaches this cabin while I live." The distant night was pierced by the occasional cry of a hawk, the rustle of dry grass, and the faint but growing sound of thousands of hooves striking the frozen earth. Rowan felt a surge of resolve. He had faced solitude, fear, and death before, but never with stakes this high, never with a life as precious and pivotal as Alaric's depending on his courage. Then, as if on cue, the enemy riders reached the clearing. They spread out, cautious, their eyes scanning for movement, expecting the cabin to be lightly defended. Rowan tensed, fingers tightening around his weapon, every nerve alert. Beside him, Alaric braced himself, the firelight glinting off his battered armor. But before the enemy could act, a distant thunder rolled across the prairie. It was not storm or wind, it was the sound of horses, hundreds of them, galloping in perfect formation. Alaric's eyes widened with disbelief and relief. "They've come," he whispered. "My brothers, they've come." From the hills descended 300 men, disciplined, armored, and resolute. Their banners fluttered in the night wind, a sea of allegiance and strength. Rowan's jaw tightened as awe and relief flooded through him. The odds had shifted. Where there had been fear, now there was power. The enemy faltered, recognizing the new reality. The cabin, the loner, and the night were not alone. Alaric struggled to rise, leaning heavily on Rowan. You did this?" he said, voice thick with gratitude and disbelief. Rowan shook his head. "You gave me trust," he replied. "That trust brought them here. It wasn't just you surviving. It was the promise you made to live, to fight, that drew them to us. The 300 men surrounded the cabin, forming a barrier between the enemy and the small outpost. Shouts rang out, swords and spears glinting in the firelight, a display of unity that no single force could challenge. The enemy hesitated, realizing the battle was already lost. They retreated, their confidence shattered, leaving Rowan, Alaric, and the arriving knights standing victorious, though not unscathed. Dawn approached slowly, painting the prairie in soft hues of amber and gold. The danger had passed, and the cabin, once a solitary refuge, was now the center of allegiance, loyalty, and the tangible proof that courage and compassion could ripple outward to create impossible strength. Alaric turned to Rowan, eyes shining with gratitude. "You saved more than my life," he said. "You saved hope. And in doing so, you've earned a bond few men can claim." Rowan nodded, the weight of the night settling into his bones, a mixture of exhaustion, pride, and something like peace. Outside, the 300 knights prepared to depart, leaving behind a sense of awe and reassurance. The prairie, vast and indifferent, had witnessed a miracle born not of war, but of courage, trust, and the quiet act of sheltering a man in need. Dawn broke over the prairie, spilling gold and amber light across frost-covered grass and jagged hills. Rowan Hark stood at the edge of the clearing, surveying the small cabin that had become a beacon of hope. Beside him, Sir Alaric stirred, still weak but alive, the first warmth of sunlight on his face highlighting the relief in his eyes. The 300 men who had arrived in the night now formed a disciplined line, banners fluttering gently in the breeze, their presence a silent declaration. No harm would come to those under their protection. Rowan felt a weight lift from his chest, a tension he hadn't realized had held him since the first hoofbeats sounded the night before. Courage had multiplied. Compassion had summoned an army. Alaric rose slowly, leaning on Rowan's shoulder. "I owe you everything," he whispered, voice husky with gratitude and exhaustion. "And yet, I see it was never about me alone. You gave me shelter, and in return, you've given life to the ideals we fight for. Loyalty, trust, honor." Rowan said nothing, letting the words hang in the crisp morning air. He had never considered himself a hero. He had merely acted because it was the right thing to do in that moment. But seeing Alaric standing tall, seeing the unwavering line of men behind them, Rowan understood the truth. Courage and mercy often create consequences far beyond what one can imagine. From the hills, the enemy approached cautiously, their numbers smaller than the force now arrayed before the cabin. Rowan's heart pounded, not from fear, but anticipation. The enemy's confidence was gone, replaced with hesitation, doubt, and the unmistakable scent of defeat. Alaric raised a hand, commanding the attention of the 300 men. His voice, though still rough from the wounds and exhaustion, carried authority honed through battles and betrayals. "Hold the line," he said firmly. "Do not strike unless provoked. Let them see the strength of what we defend." The enemy faltered at the sight. Their calculated advance became a stutter, then a stop. Men of discipline, trained for battle, were suddenly faced with an immovable force not just in number, but in resolve. The cabin, the loner, the knight, and the army they had inspired were more than walls and weapons. They were a testament to what trust and courage could create. Rowan glanced at Alaric. "They won't attack," he murmured. "Not now. They see it." Alaric nodded. "And if they had?" His eyes, steel gray and resolute, met Rowan's. "We would have fought, and together we would have prevailed. Courage is multiplied when shared." The enemy turned, retreating slowly, their confidence shattered, leaving the prairie calm once more. The 300 men lowered their weapons, the tension easing like mist lifting from the ground. Rowan felt a mixture of relief and awe. What had begun as a simple act of sheltering a dying man had grown into a force that no one could ignore. Hours later, the prairie was still. Rowan walked among the men, seeing the respect in their eyes for him, the quiet acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to protect Alaric. The knight, now steadier on his feet, approached him. "You changed the course of this morning," Alaric said softly. "And perhaps more than that, you changed the course of many lives." Rowan shook his head, brushing frost from his coat. "I did what anyone would do, or at least anyone should. Survival is not enough. Protecting what matters, that is what defines us." Alaric smiled faintly, despite the lingering pain in his shoulder. "Then let it be known. Loyalty, courage, and compassion are worth more than any weapon, any strategy, any single life. What you have done will not be forgotten." The 300 men gathered near the cabin, their presence a living shield. They were knights, warriors, and allies, bound not by orders alone but by shared belief in the power of courage and honor. Rowan realized that the act of sheltering a dying knight had created a bond larger than any one man, a ripple of loyalty that could not be broken. As the sun climbed higher, Rowan watched Alaric speak to his men, recounting the story of the night before, the isolation, the fear, the courage that had summoned aid, and the strength born from simple compassion. Rowan's heart swelled with quiet pride. They had faced the darkness, and together they had endured. Kneeling briefly, Alaric adjusted the blankets over the smaller cot, where the faint warmth of life had returned fully. "You may think this small cabin insignificant," he said, voice carrying over the crisp morning air. "But it has become a fortress, a place where courage and humanity prove stronger than any threat. A reminder that even in the loneliest places, hope can be found and multiplied." Rowan nodded, feeling the truth in Alaric's words. It was not the rifles or armor that had ensured survival. It had been the decision to act, to extend trust, to protect a life in need. And that simple choice had echoed far beyond their understanding, bringing 300 men to their side and turning fear into triumph. The prairie, once a silent expanse of cold and isolation, now seemed alive with possibility. The wind carried the distant sounds of departing men, horses moving with purpose, banners fluttering in the soft sunlight. Rowan looked at Alaric, their eyes meeting in shared understanding. "The dawn always comes," he said softly, "and with it, the chance to make a difference." Alaric rested a hand on Rowan's shoulder. "You've shown that even the smallest actions can ripple outward into power, courage, and unity. Today, a life was saved. Tomorrow, countless others may be." Rowan exhaled, feeling the weight of the night lift. The prairie was quiet again, but now it was filled with light, hope, and the promise of loyalty that could not be extinguished. In a world full of danger, betrayal, and indifference, it is often the smallest acts of compassion and courage that create the greatest impact. Protect those in need, stand for what is right, extend trust when others abandon it. One choice, one action, one act of kindness can summon the forces of loyalty, courage, and unity, transforming fear into hope and isolation into strength. Be the light that others can follow and watch how the world changes around you.